So we need to talk about how scary things are getting right now. Not dramatic scary, pattern of events scary. Because while everyone is watching missiles flying in the Middle East, something else happened that most people completely missed.
So Donald Trump fired Kristi Noem as Secretary of Homeland Security, but he didn't sideline her. He moved her to become the special envoy for the Shield of the Americas.
It sounds like a superhero movie, doesn't it? But it's actually a Monroe Doctrine reboot. A 200-year-old idea that the U.S. gets to dominate this hemisphere. And the first thing that they're doing, they're redrawing the map of who is an ally and who is a target.
And this is where we have to ask the hard questions. How are Trump and Netanyahu getting away with all of this? We have watched Israel kill over 72,000 people and rising in Gaza. It's mostly women and children.
And now that same logic is being used to invade Iran. No declaration of war, no UN approval, no vote in Congress. Just total erasure of the rules.
Just look at what happened off the coast of Sri Lanka. An American submarine torpedoed the Iranian frigate Iris Dina. This ship wasn't in a war zone. It was returning from a peaceful naval exercise with 70 other countries, including India. It was literally sailing home in international waters.
Then, without warning, a U.S. Mark 48 torpedo tore it in half. 87 sailors are dead, and it gets even worse. Under the Second Geneva Convention, you have a legal obligation to rescue survivors. The U.S., they didn't help. They let them drown. It was neutral Sri Lanka that had to pull the bodies out of the oil slick.
Let me repeat that. An American submarine sank a ship that thought it was safe. Safe because it had just taken part in a multinational naval exercise hosted by India with more than 70 countries involved, including the United States. It sailed away from that event thinking rules of international cooperation still applied. Days later, it was at the bottom of the ocean and people were dead.
Why isn't this being called a war crime? Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon literally bragged about it, saying he's not following stupid rules of engagement. What? This is the definition of a war crime.
If they can ignore the Geneva Convention in the Indian Ocean, what makes you think they'll respect it here? Just look at Cuba. The U.S. has effectively launched the first total blockade since the Cuban Missile Crisis. They've cut off the oil, threatened our trade partners, and plunged the entire island into a blackout.
Yeah, UN experts are calling this collective punishment. Hospitals are going dark, food is rotting, and Trump is calling it a friendly takeover.
That is the word that Canadians need to burn into their brains. Takeover. Because Trump has been floating that idea for more than a year. Comedians have been joking about Canada as the 51st state. Canadians, we're not laughing. But this is how Trump operates. He renames things, reframes things, and repeats them until people get numb to the idea.
Now we need to talk about that. We should all be paying very close attention to this. Trump is hosting a summit in Florida, bringing together a dozen leaders from across Latin America who align with his politics. The stated goal is security, migration, drug cartels, economic cooperation.
But the real objective is so much bigger. This is reasserting American dominance across the entire Western Hemisphere. They have rebooted the Monroe Doctrine and are now calling it the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Americas belongs to Washington and Washington only.
And look at who's actually in the room. Leaders from Argentina, El Salvador, Paraguay, and other governments that Trump considers ideological allies.
So this isn't the Americas coming together, it's a political club made up largely of controversial leaders known for suspending civil liberties, building massive prison systems, and aligning themselves with the global right-wing movement.
And that's why people in Canada, Denmark, Greenland, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America should all be paying close attention. Because when Washington starts talking about protecting the hemisphere, that means controlling every single person in it.
And while the Navy is sinking ships and Trump is demanding to name new leaders of both Venezuela and Iran, Trump is building peace in the Middle East. At least that's what he's calling it.
So he launched the Board of Peace to administer Gaza. But here's the catch. He didn't invite a single Palestinian to the table. Not one.
Instead, the executive board is stacked with Trump insiders and political allies, people like Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and other billionaires. There are also representatives from really democratic countries like Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, and the UAE.
But the people who actually live in Gaza, well, they don't get a seat at the table deciding their future. They get a separate administrative committee that answers to that board.
It's a peace board with a $1 billion entrance fee. The Vatican even refused to join it because they said it was impossible to have peace when the victims aren't allowed in the room.
Entire neighborhoods are gone. Families wiped out. And what is Trump talking about while all this is happening? Hotels, resorts, turning Gaza into a luxury hotel zone. A strip of land soaked in blood being pitched like a real estate development.
And here's the other thing that people should notice. Most of America's traditional allies refused to join this thing. France said no, Germany said no, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they all said no. Italy turned it down even, and Spain, they walked away. Ireland said absolutely not. And Prime Minister Carney, well, he never had a chance to turn down his invitation. Trump withdrew it after he got his feelings hurt in the Davos speech.
Given Trump's long history of bankruptcies and refusing to pay people who actually worked for him, a lot of people are asking the same question. Is this about peace or profit?
Now, for those of you who still think there's no way Trump is doing Vladimir Putin's work for him, well, just look at the scorecard. The Western alliance is fractured. Europe is scrambling for security, and the United States is fighting wars across multiple regions all at once.
Yeah, Russia doesn't have to defeat the West anymore. The West is exhausting itself while Putin sits back and smiles. And the rest of us, Canada, Europe, democracies everywhere, are now stuck trying to figure out how to survive the fallout.
And now Trump's using the same blank check for power to launch Operation Epic Fury, a massive U.S.-Israeli air campaign against Iran.
Anyone else notice something strange about the name? Epic Fury? Those are the same initials of the Epstein files. Now, maybe that's just a coincidence, but Trump has a long history of saying the quiet part out loud.
So if you're not in the camp that believe he's doing Vladimir Putin's work, a lot of people are asking a different question. Is this whole escalation a distraction from the Epstein files? Because Trump could have called it anything. Instead, he called it Epic Fury.
941 drones were launched towards the UAE in just 1 week. Millions are fleeing Tehran. And Trump's response? He says Iran wants to talk, but sorry, it's too late.
Which raises a pretty fundamental question here. What happened to diplomacy? Because throughout history, even during wars, diplomacy never stopped. Countries kept negotiating, prisoner exchanges happened, ceasefires, back channels were always talking. And that's how wars end.
Exactly. The rules of war are never just about weapons. They're about diplomacy. Even bitter enemies have always kept the door open to talk.
Refusing to even talk while expanding the war? Well, that's how conflicts spiral. More civilians die, city crumbles, and nations are left picking up the pieces for generations.
And historically, the leaders who shut down diplomacy are the ones who believe they can impose their will by force. They're not interested in negotiating. They're not interested in protecting civilians. They want control, regime change, resources, and the power that comes with both of those.
Which is why people are starting to ask the question out loud. What exactly is the endgame here?
Because when you actually step back and look at the whole picture of everything that's going on, if you think that the war is only in the Middle East, you need to take a look at Cuba. He's already floated the idea of a friendly takeover of Cuba to restore stability. And he's not even hiding the timeline. At a White House event, he joked that Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Cuba is next after Iran. But Trump said that they need to finish this one first.
And this brings us right back to Kristi Noem and the Shield of Americas. This weekend in Miami, Trump is meeting his select group of allied leaders. They're discussing the implementation of the Monroe Doctrine to assert U.S. preeminence over every square inch of this hemisphere.
The national security strategy is clear. The U.S. will use its superior military system to gain access to energy and mineral resources in the region. That's us. That's Canada's oil. That's our minerals.
And when the New York Post runs that cover calling Canada the 51st state, they are not joking. They are social conditioning the public for what comes next. If the U.S. can dismantle international law in Sri Lanka and Cuba with zero accountability, why would they respect our borders in Canada?
Yeah, and when the Shield of the Americas starts talking about restoring preeminence, they aren't just talking about Venezuela. They're talking about us, from Greenland to the tip of South America.
If you thought Kristi Noem was bad as ice, I'm afraid to see what she's going to do when she has the whole Western Hemisphere, from the Caribbean to campaigns in Cuba to kidnapping the Venezuela. We ain't seen nothing yet.
Nope. And if you think it stops at Venezuela or Cuba, just remember something. Trump has already floated that idea of a friendly takeover of Canada, right? He's already joked a ton about the 51st state. He's already talked about owning Greenland and taking it by force.
So when Washington starts talking about protecting the hemisphere, Canadians should hear that for what it really is, a system where the United States decides the rules and everyone else is expected to live under them.
That's a dictatorship. So the question now isn't just what happens in Gaza or Iran or Cuba. The question is whether we're watching the beginning of a world where powerful countries simply decide which countries get to stay independent and which ones don't.
But here is the part of the story that does give us hope. Because while governments are making these decisions behind closed doors, millions of ordinary Americans are out in the streets fighting back every day.
Yep, people are marching in the streets. No Kings rallies are happening across the country. Protesters are demanding accountability and trying to defend the same democratic values that built the Western Alliance in the first place.
And some of them are paying the ultimate price with their lives.
So while Trump and his sycophants are tearing the world apart right now, the people need to stick together.
Because the future of democracy in this hemisphere isn't going to be decided by one summit in Florida or one doctrine written in Washington. It's going to be decided by the people.
And that means we also need to talk to people here at home. The small minority pushing separatism in Quebec and Alberta, the online bro culture crowd convinced that life is so unbearable they'd rather burn the whole system down to the ground.
But history has already shown us where that road leads. A dictator doesn't make life easier. Authoritarian leaders don't lower your rent or fix the job market. They don't bring freedom or prosperity. They take power and they keep it.
So if you're angry right now, good. A lot of people are. But don't let anyone convince you that the solution is tearing democracy apart. Because once you give up your freedom to someone promising to fix everything, you usually don't get it back.
And that's why Canadians, Americans, and Europeans, and everyone who still believes in democracy, we need to stand together right now. We're not giving up on our neighbors, and we're not giving up on democracy in this hemisphere, ever. So let us know in the comments, do you think the Iran war is a security move to make the world a better place? Or are we watching the end of sovereign nations in the West? And what do you think is the actual endgame for the Trump regime?
And as always, if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure you like the video and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive.
And if you want to go deeper into the research behind these stories, join us over on Substack, where we post the analysis that don't always make it into the videos.
You can also support this channel by joining the A-Team and join our private Facebook group where the conversation keeps going all week long.
And if you like our t-shirts, check out the links below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we will see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.